The afternoon sun blessed Street Mary Mead's annual summer fete with the kind of golden light that made even Mrs. Price Ridley's perpetual frown seem almost benevolent. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the oak tree near the cake stall, her knitting needles clicking gently as she observed the familiar ritual of village society with the quiet attention of a naturalist studying particularly interesting specimens. The Women's Institute had outdone themselves this year. Bunting fluttered cheerfully between the stalls, and the centerpiece of the handicraft display was a magnificent black Chantilly lace mantilla, donated by Mrs. Vivienne Blackwood and positioned on an ornate gilt stand where it caught admiring glances from all who passed. The delicate Spanish lace seemed to shimmer in the dappled sunlight, its intricate patterns telling stories of distant romance and forgotten elegance. Mrs. Blackwood herself moved gracefully between the guests, her auburn hair catching the light as she dispensed charm with the practiced ease of a woman born to hostess duties. Her daughter Helena stood near the archery range, engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly heated discussion with young Dr. Timothy Marsh. Miss Marple noticed how Helena's fingers worried at the black lace collar of her blouse. A nervous habit, perhaps, or simply the unconscious gesture of a woman under strain. Colonel Weatherby held court by the coconut shy, regaling anyone within earshot with tales of his military service, while his wife hovered nearby like a pale moth, occasionally glancing anxiously toward the refreshment tent. The new vicar, Mr. Pembridge, stood awkwardly beside the jam stall, still learning the intricate social choreography that governed village gatherings. At precisely 3:30, the brass band struck up a cheerful waltz, and Mrs. Blackwood announced that the raffle drawing would commence shortly. It was then that Helena's voice rose sharply above the general murmur. "Treated like a child, I am perfectly capable of making my own decisions." The music faltered as heads turned toward the disturbance. "Doctor," Marsh reached for Helena's arm, but she pulled away with such vehemence that she stumbled backward into the display stand. The beautiful mantilla fluttered to the ground like a wounded bird. "Helena, dear, please." Mrs. Blackwood hurried forward, her face flushed with embarrassment. But Helena was already striding toward the house, leaving the crumpled lace lying forgotten on the grass. Miss Marple watched thoughtfully as Dr. Marsh bent to retrieve the delicate fabric, noting how his hands trembled slightly as he smoothed its folds. The festive atmosphere resumed, though with an undercurrent of whispered speculation. Mrs. Blackwood apologized graciously for the disruption, and the mantilla was carefully repositioned on its stand. Miss Marple observed that several people took particular interest in examining the lace more closely. Now Mrs. Price Ridley with her lorgnette, Colonel Weatherby with the appreciative eye of a man who understood valuable things, and surprisingly, the mousy Mrs. Weatherby, whose fingers traced the air above the intricate patterns as if she were reading Braille. 20 minutes later, a piercing scream shattered the afternoon calm. It came from the direction of the house, from the conservatory where Mrs. Blackwood grew her prize orchids. The brass band stopped mid-note, and an eerie silence fell over the gathering. They found Helena Blackwood among the overturned plant pots, the black lace mantilla wound tightly around her throat, its delicate beauty transformed into an instrument of death. Her dark eyes stared sightlessly at the glass ceiling, where clouds drifted peacefully across the summer sky. Miss Marple arrived with the others, moving slowly but purposefully. While everyone else stared in horror at the tragic scene, her keen eyes noted the small details: a torn fingernail, a smudge of potting soil on the victim's shoe, and most curious of all, a single thread of black lace caught on the conservatory door handle at precisely the height where someone considerably shorter than Helena would have grasped it. The discovery seemed to suspend time itself, leaving the assembled villagers frozen in a tableau of shock and disbelief. Dr. Marsh knelt beside Helena's still form, his medical training overriding personal emotion as he checked for vital signs that everyone already knew would not be found. After what felt like an eternity, he shook his head solemnly. "She's gone," he said quietly. his voice barely audible above Mrs. Blackwood's stifled sobs. Miss Marple moved with quiet efficiency to Mrs. Blackwood's side, offering a clean handkerchief and gentle murmurs about the unreliability of garden paths in summer shoes. Inconsequential observations that somehow provided more comfort than dramatic consolations ever could. The bereaved mother's gaze remained fixed on the beautiful black lace wound cruelly around her daughter's throat. "My mantilla," she whispered, then with heartbreaking politeness, "Oh, poor Helena." Colonel Weatherby assumed command with military precision. "Nobody leaves the premises," he announced firmly. "Pembridge, telephone the police immediately." The vicar, pale and visibly shaken, hurried toward the house to comply. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to miss an opportunity for moral observation, declared in carrying whispers that this was precisely what came of modern young women having too much freedom, before immediately beginning to catalogue everyone she had observed near the house during the crucial period. Inspector Craddock arrived from Much Benham within the hour, bringing with him an air of weary professionalism and a constable who dutifully began cordoning off the conservatory. The inspector's weathered features took in the scene with practiced efficiency, his attention immediately drawn to the obvious elements: the valuable lace, the overturned orchid pots, the victim's position among the scattered blooms. "Domestic dispute, most likely," Colonel Weatherby offered helpfully. "Young lovers' quarrel that got out of hand. Heard it countless times during my service. Passions flare. Things escalate beyond reason." His pointed glance toward Dr. Marsh left little doubt about his suspicions. Mrs. Price Ridley nodded vigorously. "They were arguing quite publicly earlier." "Inspector," right by the archery range, voices raised for everyone to hear. That poor girl seemed terribly distressed about something. Dr. Marsh, who had been standing apart, with shoulders slumped in grief, looked up sharply. "We had a disagreement, yes, but I would never. Helena was planning to leave street. Mary Mead wanted a different life than I could offer. But I loved her. Inspector, I would never harm her." Miss Marple, positioned on a nearby garden bench with her knitting, observed these exchanges with the quiet attention of someone watching a familiar play unfold. Her needles clicked gently as she noted the various reactions: Dr. Marsh's genuine anguish, Mrs. Weatherby's nervous fidgeting with her sleeves, the vicar's oddly intent examination of the conservatory doorframe when he thought no one was looking. Inspector Craddock began taking formal statements, his methodical approach suggesting he was already forming preliminary theories. The obvious narrative: a passionate young doctor, a heated argument, a tragic escalation, seemed to satisfy most of the assembled villagers. Even the inspector appeared inclined toward this straightforward explanation, but Miss Marple's keen eyes had noticed details that others overlooked. The black thread still clinging to the door handle at precisely the wrong height for Dr. Marsh's tall frame. The careful way the lace had been arranged, almost ceremonially, around Helena's throat. The faint scent of violet powder that had nothing to do with orchids, and everything to do with someone who had handled the mantilla recently. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the formal investigation began in earnest, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations. The truth, she knew from long experience, rarely announced itself with the obvious drama that satisfied most people. Instead, it whispered through small inconsistencies, nervous gestures, and the countless tiny deceptions that people told themselves and others when faced with tragedy. The village had reacted predictably. But somewhere among the grief, gossip, and hasty conclusions, a murderer was watching and waiting, perhaps already congratulating themselves on how perfectly their careful plan was unfolding. The drawing room at Blackwood House had been transformed into an impromptu interview chamber, its usual genteel atmosphere now weighted with the gravity of Inspector Craddock's methodical questioning. Miss Marple had positioned herself unobtrusively in a corner chair, her knitting providing the perfect camouflage for her keen observations as each witness was called forward to provide their account of the afternoon's tragic events. Dr. Marsh was interviewed first, his tall frame seeming to fold in on itself as he sat rigidly upright in the chintz armchair. His hands trembled slightly as he recounted the argument with Helena, his voice thick with emotion. "She told me she was leaving for London. Perhaps as soon as tomorrow," he said, running his fingers through his dishevelled hair. "Helena felt suffocated here," said Street. "Mary Mead would strangle the life out of her." He paused, the unfortunate choice of words hanging heavily in the air. "I tried to reason with her, told her we could build a good life together here, but she was determined. When she stormed off, I didn't follow immediately, Mrs. Weatherby had felt faint, and I fetched her some water from the refreshment tent. Mrs. Weatherby, when called upon, offered her testimony in barely audible whispers, her pale hands worrying at the lace trim of her sleeves. "I don't recall feeling particularly unwell," she said hesitantly, contradicting Dr. Marsh's account. "Though the sun was rather bright, I spent most of the afternoon helping with the tea service." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly, noting this discrepancy while also detecting the faint but unmistakable scent of violet powder that seemed to emanate from Mrs. Weatherby's direction, an old-fashioned fragrance that spoke of grandmother's dressing tables rather than modern preferences. Colonel Weatherby provided his testimony with military precision, consulting his pocket watch as he spoke. Argument commenced at precisely 15:20 hours, concluded with the young lady's dramatic exit at 15:25. I remained at my post by the coconut shy throughout the afternoon, never left the field until we heard the scream. His certainty about these exact timings struck Miss Marple as curious. Such attention to detail suggested he had been expecting something significant to occur. The vicar, Mr. Pembridge, appeared notably nervous as he described his movements. I went to ask Mrs. Blackwood if the raffle should be postponed, using the side corridor by the conservatory. The door handle seemed rather stiff when I passed, stuck a little, I thought. Miss Marple observed his ink-stained fingers and the way his eyes kept darting toward the conservatory entrance as if drawn by some magnetic force. Mrs. Blackwood herself maintained admirable composure throughout her interview, though Miss Marple detected something almost rehearsed in her grief. Helena had been restless lately, speaking often of adventure and excitement beyond our quiet village. "The mantilla was my mother's. I donated it in a spirit of community, though Helena found such gestures provincial." Her voice remained steady, controlled, the grief of someone who had already processed their loss rather than experiencing fresh shock. As the formal interviews concluded, the general consensus among the villagers crystallized around Dr. Marsh as the obvious suspect. Mrs. Price Ridley held court near the window, her voice carrying clearly as she declared, "A crime of passion, mark my words. The poor boy was head over heels, and she broke his heart. Men do terrible things when their pride is wounded." But Miss Marple's experienced eye had caught details that troubled her deeply. The black lace thread still clinging to the conservatory door handle was positioned at a height more consistent with someone of average stature, not Dr. Marsh's considerable height. The careful arrangement of the mantilla around Helena's throat suggested premeditation rather than passionate impulse, and as Miss Marple knew from long observation of human nature, there was a distinct difference between how men and women tied things. Men, in her experience, made hasty, functional knots, while women created neat, deliberate arrangements. Most intriguingly, she had noticed during her brief examination of the conservatory that one orchid pot had been set upright too precisely among the general disorder, like a card placed back into a deck by an unpracticed hand. The faint crescent-shaped chip in the paint just below the door latch suggested someone wearing a ring had grasped the handle with particular force or urgency. As Inspector Craddock concluded his preliminary investigation, clearly satisfied with the straightforward narrative of a lover's quarrel gone tragically wrong, Miss Marple folded her knitting with characteristic precision. The truth, she knew, rarely announced itself with such convenient obviousness. Instead, it whispered through small contradictions, nervous gestures, and the countless tiny deceptions that people told themselves when faced with the need to conceal guilt. The evening shadows were lengthening across the garden, and somewhere among the grief, gossip, and hasty conclusions, a murderer was watching the investigation unfold, perhaps already congratulating themselves on how perfectly their careful plan was proceeding. As the last of the evening light faded from the conservatory's glass panes, Inspector Craddock concluded his preliminary investigation with evident satisfaction. The case, to his experienced eye, presented itself with refreshing clarity. A lover's quarrel escalated beyond reason, tragic but hardly mysterious. He dismissed the remaining villagers with instructions to remain available for further questioning, though his manner suggested he considered the matter all but closed. Miss Marple lingered as the others departed, ostensibly searching for her reading spectacles, which she claimed to have mislaid during the afternoon's commotion. This small deception allowed her to examine the conservatory more closely, while the constable busied himself with securing the scene. The brass door handle, she noted, bore that particular resistance of a latch not quite true to its frame, the sort of mechanical rebellion that required a firm, knowing grip to overcome. The tiny crescent-shaped chip in the paint just below the handle gleamed fresh in the lamplight, its edges sharp and unweathered. Mrs. Weatherby appeared in the corridor like a pale moth drawn to flame, her explanation about a forgotten handkerchief delivered in whispers that seemed to apologize for their very existence. Miss Marple observed with interest that the colonel's wife now wore gloves despite the evening warmth, their pearl buttons catching the light as her hands fluttered nervously at her sides. The left glove appeared strained at the ring finger, as if hastily pulled over something tender or swollen, and a faint dusting of what looked remarkably like potting soil clung to the fabric's edge. Most intriguingly, the scent of violet powder hung about Mrs. Weatherby like an invisible cloud, not the light application of morning toilette, but the heavy, deliberate fragrance of someone who had recently handled something steeped in this old-fashioned perfume. Miss Marple had noticed this same distinctive scent near the gilt stand that had displayed the mantilla, where trampled grass formed an oddly precise path between the display and the conservatory entrance. The vicar emerged from the service passage, his arms laden with hymn sheets in a touching attempt to restore order through familiar ritual. "That side door has been troublesome for months," he confided, his ink-stained fingers gesturing toward the conservatory entrance. "Catches something dreadful. I mentioned it to Mrs. Blackwood only last week. When I passed earlier, before the tragedy, the handle was definitely stiff. Odd thing to remember at such a time, I know, but one's mind fixes on the strangest details." His observation confirmed Miss Marple's own assessment of the door's mechanical temperament, but more significantly, it established that someone of the vicar's modest stature would indeed need to grasp the handle at precisely the height where that telltale black thread still clung. Mrs. Blackwood received Miss Marple in her bedroom with the composed grace of someone who had already begun the long process of arranging grief into manageable portions. The room's immaculate order spoke of a woman who faced crisis by imposing control on her immediate environment. On the dressing table, a small valise lay open, revealing a railway timetable with departures to London marked in Helena's distinctive hand. The tickets were dated for the following day, a detail that cast Helena's urgent desire to leave in a new and rather desperate light. "She had been making plans," Mrs. Blackwood said, following Miss Marple's gaze to the timetable. Helena felt that Street Mary Mead had nothing more to offer her. She spoke often of London, of opportunities and excitement beyond our quiet ways. Her voice carried the measured tone of someone reciting well-rehearsed explanations, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of something more complex than simple maternal grief. Downstairs, Colonel Weatherby continued to hold court in the drawing room, his military precision lending authority to his timeline of events. 15:20 hours for the commencement of hostilities. 15:25 for the young lady's tactical withdrawal, he declared to Mrs. Price Ridley, who absorbed each detail with the avidity of a collector acquiring rare specimens. Dr. Marsh stood apart near the cold fireplace, his tall frame seeming to fold inward under the weight of suspicion and sorrow. Miss Marple noted how readily the assembled company had accepted the narrative of passionate crime. It satisfied their understanding of how such tragedies unfolded, providing clear motives and obvious suspects. Even Inspector Craddock, experienced though he was, seemed content with the straightforward explanation that passion had led to violence. But as Miss Marple made her quiet way home through the evening shadows, her mind turned over the accumulating inconsistencies like a gardener examining soil for hidden stones. The careful arrangement of the lace around Helena's throat spoke of deliberate purpose rather than desperate impulse. The positioning of evidence, that conveniently upright orchid pot, the medical precision of the strangulation, suggested a mind that planned rather than one that acted in the heat of emotion. Most troubling of all was the growing certainty that someone had moved through the conservatory with the confidence of familiarity, someone who knew exactly where to step and how to arrange the scene for maximum effect. The violet-scented thread on the door handle, the precise path through the trampled grass, the careful placement of incriminating evidence, all pointed to a mind that understood not only how to commit murder, but how to ensure that suspicion fell elsewhere. As she reached her cottage gate, Miss Marple paused to glance back toward Blackwood House, where lamplight glowed in several windows. Somewhere behind those genteel facades, a murderer was likely reviewing the day's events with satisfaction, confident that their careful orchestration had achieved its intended effect. The village had its villain in Dr. Marsh, the police had their obvious solution, and the true perpetrator remained safely hidden behind a mask of respectability and manufactured grief. The morning brought to Street Mary Mead, that peculiar atmosphere which always follows tragedy in small communities, a mixture of genuine sorrow and barely concealed excitement that manifested itself in hushed conversations and meaningful glances. Miss Marple emerged from her cottage with the deliberate purpose of someone who understood that information, like cream, rises to the surface when properly encouraged. Her first destination was the post office, where Mrs. Clement proved eager to share intelligence gathered through her privileged position as keeper of the village's correspondence. "Such a dreadful business, Miss Marple," she confided while sorting the morning mail with practiced efficiency. "Though I must tell you, that poor Miss Helena seemed quite desperate about something yesterday morning. She posted an urgent letter to some London solicitor, Pemberton, Whitfield and Associates, if memory serves, and kept checking her watch as if time were running terribly short. And there was a telegram for her as well, came in early. Rooms arranged. Tuesday without fail. Mrs. Blackwood collected it herself, said she was saving the boy a journey." The pieces of Helena's urgent departure plans were becoming clearer, suggesting matters far more complex than simple romantic restlessness. Miss Marple accepted her stamps with appropriate murmurs while mentally cataloguing these crucial details. At the chemist's shop, Mr. Reeve leaned confidentially across his counter, eager to contribute to the morning's intelligence gathering. "The inspector's been asking questions naturally. Curious thing, though Mrs. Weatherby's been making unusual purchases lately. Violet sachets yesterday, and a fresh tin of poudre de violet just last week. She's normally a lavender lady, you understand. And arnica liniment at closing time yesterday for bruising," she said. Seemed rather flustered about it. Miss Marple found Mrs. Weatherby tending the memorial flower beds with unusual vigor, her gloved hands working among the roses despite the morning's warmth. The pearl buttons that had adorned yesterday's gloves had been replaced with plain ones, and most tellingly, her wedding ring was conspicuously absent from her thin finger. "Such terrible business," Mrs. Weatherby murmured, without looking up, "though I suppose these passionate young people never consider consequences." As she spoke, her left glove strained visibly at the ring finger, and when she adjusted her grip on the pruning shears, the seam gave way with a tiny snap. The leather gaped, revealing a purpling bruise and crescent-shaped graze precisely where a ring would bite during sudden, forceful movement. "Oh dear," Miss Marple said gently, producing her mending kit with practiced ease. "Such delicate work requires steady hands." Under this domestic pretext, she engaged Mrs. Weatherby in conversation about lace, watching with interest as the Colonel's wife brightened unexpectedly. "Not true, Chantilly. I think the ground's too even for genuine handmade work. Machine-made on levers looms, but quality nonetheless. You can tell by how the motifs sit you'd never pleat it sharp without damaging the pattern." She stopped abruptly, color rising in her cheeks. "I kept a small millinery counter before marriage. Strange how old knowledge lingers." The sound of Colonel Weatherby's motor horn interrupted further questioning, his brusque "Hilda," causing his wife to flinch and hastily tug her damaged glove, wincing as the fabric scraped her injured finger. Later, visiting Mrs. Blackwood to offer condolences, Miss Marple learned another crucial detail from the vicar, who mentioned seeing Mrs. Blackwood making careful adjustments to the mantilla just before the raffle drawing. "She seemed to be reinforcing something, perhaps a weak spot in the lace," he observed innocently, as Miss Marple walked home through the village's familiar streets. The morning's revelations formed a disturbing pattern. Helena's desperate legal consultations, the prepared mantilla, Mrs. Weatherby's suspicious injuries and expertise with lace, the missing wedding ring, all pointed toward careful premeditation rather than passionate crime. Someone had orchestrated not just murder, but the perfect misdirection that would ensure an innocent man bore the blame. The violet powder that connected Mrs. Weatherby to the mantilla, combined with her obvious expertise in handling delicate fabrics and her mysterious injuries, painted a picture far more complex than the village's eager assignment of guilt to Dr. Marsh. Miss Marple understood that the truth, as always, lay hidden beneath layers of respectability and carefully constructed deception. The afternoon brought Inspector Craddock to Miss Marple's cottage gate, his confident stride and satisfied expression suggesting a man who believed justice was within reach. He accepted her offer of tea with the gracious manner of someone delivering welcome news to a concerned citizen. "I thought you'd be pleased to know we'll be making an arrest shortly," he announced, settling into the familiar chintz armchair with evident relief. "Dr. Marsh has admitted to following Miss Helena to the conservatory after their quarrel. His story keeps changing, first claiming he never left the fete grounds, now admitting he pursued her. Classic pattern of a guilty conscience revealing itself through contradictions." Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands, her expression thoughtfully serene. "How very distressing for everyone involved. Though I wonder, did Dr. Marsh explain how he managed to arrange the lace so precisely?" Experience. Men in emotional distress tend toward rather hasty actions, not the careful positioning we observed. The inspector waved away her concern with professional confidence. "Crime of passion doesn't preclude deliberate staging afterward, Miss Marple. The evidence is quite clear he had motive, opportunity, and now he's changing his story." After the inspector's departure, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the investigation's hasty direction. Her afternoon walk took her to Blackwood House, where she offered condolences and a cutting from her prize fuchsia. The drawing room, usually immaculate, now held subtle signs of disturbance, papers hastily tidied, and on a side table beneath Helena's photograph, a freshly opened letter bearing the crest of Pemberton, Whitfield and Associates. "Such a shock about dear Helena." Mrs. Blackwood sighed, her composure still remarkable. She had been pursuing some complicated legal matter regarding her father's estate, a family trust that she felt had been mishandled. Quite beyond her understanding. Really, I told her it would mean endless expense for very little return. Her gaze drifted to Helena's photograph, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of something harder than grief before it was quickly masked. Continuing her walk past the Weatherby cottage, Miss Marple observed Colonel Weatherby's motor car in the drive and heard raised voices through partially open windows. The Colonel's military bark carried clearly. "Ridiculous notion, Hilda. You've been acting strangely since yesterday, nervous as a cat, jumping at shadows. If you know something about this dreadful business, you must speak up immediately." Mrs. Weatherby's response came as barely audible murmurs, but Miss Marple caught fragments. Never meant. Such a terrible accident. Can't understand. The conversation ceased abruptly when Colonel Weatherby noticed Miss Marple's presence. He emerged with military briskness, his weathered face flushed with irritation. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Dreadful business about young Helena. My wife's been quite overwrought. Women's nerves, you understand. We're taking a brief holiday. Leaving for Brighton this evening. Sea air will do her good." The hasty departure struck Miss Marple as curious timing, particularly given Inspector Craddock's request that witnesses remain available. Mrs. Weatherby appeared behind her husband like a pale shadow, now wearing heavier gloves despite the warm afternoon, her movements suggesting someone favoring an injured hand. At the church, Miss Marple encountered the vicar, arranging flowers in the vestry, his ink-stained fingers working delicately among the blooms. "Something has been troubling me about yesterday afternoon," he confided. "When I passed the conservatory before the tragedy, I distinctly heard voices not arguing, but what sounded like instruction. A woman's voice, very precise and careful, as if explaining something important. I assumed it was Mrs. Blackwood speaking with Helena about arrangements, but the tone was wrong, too formal, almost rehearsed. This revelation cast the afternoon's events in entirely new light. Miss Marple encouraged him gently, her knitting needles clicking thoughtfully as she absorbed this crucial detail. As evening shadows gathered, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating evidence that contradicted the obvious narrative. Helena's legal pursuits regarding her father's estate, Mrs. Weatherby's suspicious injuries and behavior, the Colonel's hasty departure plans, and now testimony about instructional voices in the conservatory all suggested careful orchestration rather than passionate crime. The truth was emerging like a photograph in developing solution, each detail adding clarity to a picture that revealed not a lover's quarrel, but a far more calculated conspiracy designed to use the village's assumptions as weapons more deadly than the lace itself. The morning brought Miss Marple to her garden gate with the deliberate purpose of someone who understood that truth, like her prize roses, required patient cultivation. Her first destination was the post office, where she dispatched a carefully worded telegram to her cousin Raymond in London, requesting discreet inquiries about Pemberton, Whitfield and Associates, and any recent correspondence regarding the Blackwood family trust. As she emerged from the post office, the sound of raised voices from the direction of the Weatherby cottage caught her attention. Colonel Weatherby's military bark carried clearly across the morning air, punctuated by his wife's barely audible responses. Miss Marple's keen hearing detected fragments that troubled her deeply. "Must leave immediately. No choice in the matter. You've said quite enough already." Arriving at the cottage under the pretext of returning a borrowed felon gardening book, Miss Marple found the household in a state of barely controlled chaos. Trunks stood ready by the motor car, and Mrs. Weatherby moved between them with the nervous efficiency of someone packing under duress. Her gloves, Miss Marple noted, were different from yesterday's heavier leather that completely concealed her hands, despite the morning's warmth. "Ah, Miss Marple," Colonel Weatherby announced with forced heartiness, consulting his pocket watch. "Just leaving for Brighton. Sea air, you know, excellent for the nerves. My wife has been quite overwrought since yesterday's tragedy." Mrs. Weatherby offered a tremulous smile, her eyes darting anxiously between her husband and their visitor. "Such dreadful business," she murmured, her voice strained. "Poor Helena, and that terrible mantilla." She stopped abruptly, color draining from her face as she realized what she had said. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently. "Such beautiful work, that Chantilly lace. Though I confess, I wondered about the way it was arranged. It showed such expertise, almost professional knowledge of how delicate fabrics behave under stress." Mrs. Weatherby's composure cracked visibly. Her gloved hands trembled as she clutched her coat more tightly around herself, and Miss Marple caught the faint but unmistakable scent of violet powder that seemed to follow her like a guilty conscience. At that moment, Constable Briggs appeared at the garden gate, his usually jovial expression replaced by official seriousness. "Begging your pardon, Colonel, but Inspector Craddock's orders are that no witnesses are to leave the village until the investigation is complete." Colonel Weatherby's face flushed with indignation. "This is harassment, Constable. My wife requires medical attention, Doctor." Marsh himself recommended immediate rest and change of air. "Very sorry, sir, but orders are orders," Briggs replied steadfastly. "Inspector says, as how important evidence might still come to light." As Mrs. Weatherby turned toward the house with defeated resignation, something small and metallic slipped from her coat pocket, landing silently on the gravel path. Miss Marple, with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to retrieving dropped stitches, bent to retrieve it before anyone else noticed. It was a silver thimble, intricately engraved with tiny roses, its surface worn smooth by years of use. But most significantly, caught in the delicate engravings around its rim, were several minute fibers of black lace. And the faint, sweet scent of violet powder clung to the metal like evidence of recent, intimate contact. Miss Marple examined the thimble with the careful attention of someone who understood the language of needlework. This was not the simple thimble of an amateur seamstress, but the professional tool of someone who had earned their living with needle and thread. The wear patterns spoke of countless hours spent working with delicate fabrics, and the tiny fibers embedded in its surface told a story of recent, careful manipulation of Chantilly lace. "I believe you've dropped something, Mrs. Weatherby," Miss Marple said quietly, extending the thimble toward its owner. Mrs. Weatherby's face went ashen. She stared at the small silver object as if it were a serpent, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. I don't know how." She reached for it with trembling fingers, then seemed to think better of the gesture, her hands falling to her sides in defeat. Colonel Weatherby's sharp eyes took in the scene with military assessment. "Hilda collects such things," he said curtly. "Sentimental nonsense from her millinery days. Constable, surely my wife's health takes precedence over bureaucratic procedures." But Constable Briggs had noticed Mrs. Weatherby's reaction to the thimble, and his country shrewdness recognized guilt when he saw it. "Perhaps the inspector should have a word with Mrs. Weatherby before any travel arrangements are finalized," he suggested diplomatically. As the little group stood in awkward tableau around the damning evidence, Miss Marple reflected on how often the truth revealed itself through the smallest details. The thimble represented more than mere coincidence. It was tangible proof of Mrs. Weatherby's intimate involvement with the very lace that had killed Helena Blackwood. Combined with her expertise in handling delicate fabrics, her suspicious injuries, and her husband's urgent desire to remove her from scrutiny, the evidence painted a picture far more complex than the village's eager assignment of guilt to Dr. Marsh. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the cottage garden, and somewhere in those shadows, Miss Marple knew, lay the key to understanding not just who had killed Helena Blackwood, but why the truth had been so carefully obscured behind a facade of obvious suspects and passionate motives. The silver thimble lying on the cottage path had transformed the morning's atmosphere from one of routine investigation to urgent revelation. Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, his earlier confidence replaced by the methodical wariness of a professional reconsidering established conclusions. He examined the delicate object with careful attention, noting the embedded lace fibers that caught the light like tiny accusations. Mrs. Weatherby sat rigidly in her drawing-room chair, her gloved hands clasped so tightly that the leather strained at the seams. Colonel Weatherby stood behind her with military protectiveness, though his weathered features betrayed growing confusion as the implications of the evidence became clear. "Mrs. Weatherby," Inspector Craddock began formally, "the thimble bears traces of the black Chantilly lace used in Miss Helena's murder. I must ask you to explain your connection to this evidence." The colonel's wife seemed to shrink into herself, her voice emerging as barely a whisper. "I helped Mrs. Blackwood with the mantilla yesterday morning, Inspector." There was a loose thread, and she asked me to mend it properly before the display. I took it to the conservatory where the light was better. Her eyes darted desperately between her husband and the inspector. It was just needlework, nothing more. I gave it back to her immediately after the repair. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked thoughtfully as she observed the confession's careful limitations. Mrs. Weatherby admitted to handling the lace but maintained precise boundaries around her involvement, like someone who had rehearsed exactly how much truth to reveal. Colonel Weatherby stepped forward, his face flushed with protective indignation. "My wife is an accomplished seamstress, Inspector. She often assists the ladies with such matters. This hardly constitutes evidence of murder." "And the bruising on your hand, Mrs. Weatherby?" Craddock pressed, his gaze steady. "The injuries you've been concealing beneath those gloves?" Mrs. Weatherby's composure wavered visibly. "I fell while working in the conservatory. The orchid pots are quite heavy, and I'm not as steady as I once was. My arthritis makes me clumsy with delicate work." The explanation felt rehearsed, and Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Weatherby's eyes avoided direct contact while speaking. More tellingly, the scent of violet powder still clung faintly to her clothing, suggesting far more intimate contact with the mantilla than a simple mending would require. At Miss Marple's gentle suggestion, Inspector Craddock sought out the vicar to clarify his earlier observations. Mr. Pembridge, found arranging fresh flowers in the vestry, proved eager to assist with more precise details about what he had overheard. The voices were quite distinct. "Inspector," he explained, his ink-stained fingers pausing in their work. "Not an argument, as one might expect, but something more like instruction. I heard phrases such as, 'Hold it steady and mind the tension carefully.' The tone was that of someone teaching a delicate technique to another person." This testimony cast Mrs. Weatherby's presence in the conservatory in an entirely different light. Miss Marple reflected that such instructional language suggested not simple mending, but something far more complex, requiring careful guidance and precise execution. Inspector Craddock's investigation then led him to Mrs. Blackwood, who received them in her study with remarkable composure, considering the circumstances. On her desk lay correspondence from Pemberton, Whitfield and Associates, the London solicitors whose name had appeared repeatedly in connection with Helena's urgent business. Helena had been pursuing some complicated legal matter regarding her father's estate, Mrs. Blackwood explained with practiced calm. A family trust that she felt had been improperly managed, quite beyond her understanding, really, but she was determined to challenge the arrangements. Her voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining a child's unreasonable demands. Miss Marple's keen eyes noted that the legal documents were positioned with suspicious convenience, as if arranged for viewing. More significantly, she observed that Mrs. Blackwood's hands showed no signs of the violet powder that had marked both the mantilla and Mrs. Weatherby, despite her claim to have handled the lace extensively during its preparation. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple pieced together the emerging pattern with the methodical precision of someone assembling a complex puzzle. Mrs. Weatherby's expertise with delicate fabrics, her presence in the conservatory during the crucial period, and her obvious injuries suggested direct involvement in Helena's death. But the instructional voices heard by the vicar implied collaboration, and Helena's urgent legal consultations provided a motive far more substantial than romantic disappointment. The inheritance angle explained Helena's desperate timeline and her determination to reach London despite Dr. Marsh's objections. If she had discovered irregularities in her father's trust, the financial implications could be devastating for whoever had benefited from those irregularities. Miss Marple understood that money, particularly family money managed over years, provided motives far more compelling than passion. As Inspector Craddock prepared to return to the station with Mrs. Weatherby for formal questioning, Miss Marple reflected on how often the obvious narrative concealed more complex truths. The village had been eager to accept Dr. Marsh's guilt because it satisfied their understanding of how such tragedies unfolded. But the real conspiracy had hidden behind facades of respectability and carefully orchestrated evidence, using the community's assumptions as weapons more deadly than the lace itself. The thimble had been the first crack in a carefully constructed deception, but Miss Marple sensed that the full truth would require one final, delicate confrontation to expose the complete scope of the conspiracy that had transformed a piece of beautiful lace into an instrument of calculated murder. Mrs. Weatherby's removal to the police station had transformed the village atmosphere from speculation to grim certainty, though not in the direction most had expected. Word spread quickly through street. Mary Mead, that the colonel's wife had made startling admissions about her involvement in Helena's death, admissions that pointed toward a far more complex conspiracy than anyone had imagined. Miss Marple received Raymond's telegram that evening, its contents confirming her growing suspicions about the true motive behind the tragedy. Pemberton, Whitfield and Associates had indeed been investigating the Blackwood family trust at Helena's request, and their preliminary findings suggested significant irregularities in the administration of her father's estate. The young woman had discovered that certain annuities had been redirected and property valuations manipulated, discrepancies that would have cost Mrs. Blackwood substantial sums if exposed and corrected. Armed with this crucial intelligence, Miss Marple made her way to Blackwood House the following morning, carrying a small basket of preserves as pretext for her visit. She found Mrs. Blackwood in the morning room, maintaining her characteristic composure despite the previous day's dramatic developments. The legal correspondence that had been so prominently displayed now lay neatly stacked, suggesting careful reorganization of potentially damaging evidence. Such distressing news about poor Mrs. Weatherby, Miss Marple began gently, settling into the offered chair with her knitting. Though I confess myself puzzled by some aspects of her confession, she seems to suggest that someone with considerable expertise guided her actions in the conservatory. Mrs. Blackwood's smile remained perfectly controlled. Hilda has always been prone to nervous fantasies, Miss Marple. The strain of the investigation has clearly affected her judgment. I fear she's attempting to implicate others in her unfortunate involvement. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking thoughtfully. Though it occurs to me that Helena's urgent legal consultations might have created considerable anxiety for those who might be affected by her discoveries. My cousin Raymond, who has some knowledge of such matters, tells me that trust irregularities can have quite devastating financial consequences when exposed. For the first time, Mrs. Blackwood's composure showed the slightest crack. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her teacup, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of calculation in her eyes before the mask of grief reasserted itself. Helena had developed some rather fanciful notions about her inheritance. Mrs. Blackwood replied carefully. She felt that certain aspects of her father's estate had been improperly managed, though her understanding of such complex financial arrangements was quite limited. I tried to discourage her from pursuing expensive legal consultations that would only have brought scandal upon our family name. Miss Marple's keen observation noted how Mrs. Blackwood spoke of Helena's concerns as fanciful notions rather than legitimate grievances, suggesting a dismissive attitude that might mask genuine worry about what those investigations might reveal. The sound of Inspector Craddock's motor car in the drive interrupted their conversation. He entered with the grave expression of someone bearing significant news, his earlier confidence in Dr. Marsh's guilt now completely abandoned. "Mrs. Blackwood," he began formally, "I'm afraid Mrs. Weatherby has made some rather detailed allegations about yesterday's events. She claims you approached her that morning with a specific request, not for simple mending, but for assistance in demonstrating how the mantilla might be used as a restraint. She also alleges that you convinced her the death was accidental and that staging the scene was necessary to protect both your reputations." Mrs. Blackwood's response came with practiced smoothness, though Miss Marple detected the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed her explanations. "Inspector, surely you cannot credit such desperate fabrications from a woman clearly attempting to deflect suspicion from her own inexplicable behavior. But Miss Marple had observed enough to recognize the calculated nature of Mrs. Blackwood's responses, each answer carefully constructed to address specific accusations while avoiding broader implications. The inheritance motive, combined with Mrs. Blackwood's obvious expertise in handling delicate lace and her ability to manipulate the nervous Mrs. Weatherby, painted a picture of premeditated murder disguised as passionate crime. As Inspector Craddock prepared to continue his questioning, Miss Marple reflected that the final revelation would require one more carefully orchestrated confrontation to expose the complete scope of the deception that had transformed a mother's greed into a daughter's death. The drawing room at Blackwood House had acquired the hushed intensity of a courtroom as Inspector Craddock continued his methodical questioning. Miss Marple observed from her corner chair, her knitting needles moving with deceptive tranquility, while her keen eyes noted every subtle shift in Mrs. Blackwood's carefully maintained composure. "I find myself returning to that beautiful mantilla," Miss Marple said conversationally, her voice carrying the gentle persistence of someone pursuing an interesting puzzle. Such exquisite precision in how it was arranged around poor Helena's throat, almost ceremonial, one might say. It reminded me of something I once observed in a millinery shop, the way an expert demonstrates proper technique to ensure delicate lace bears weight without tearing. Mrs. Blackwood's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer. "I'm sure I wouldn't know about such technical matters." "Oh, but surely you would," Miss Marple continued with innocent persistence. "After all, Mrs. Weatherby has provided quite detailed testimony about your instruction yesterday morning. She describes how you demonstrated the precise method for creating what you called proper tension without damaging the lace structure. She was most impressed by your expertise. Weatherby claims you showed her how to twist and secure the lace using specific anchor points, ostensibly to teach her proper handling. She says you were quite insistent about the technique, emphasizing that one must never stress the net ground, but work through the motif stems. The technical terminology hung in the air like an accusation. Mrs. Blackwood's hands moved involuntarily to her lap, fingers intertwining with barely controlled tension. "Furthermore," Miss Marple added gently, "there is the matter of that troublesome conservatory door. The vicar mentioned its stiffness, yet, when I observed you yesterday, you managed it with remarkable ease, the precise lift and twist motion of someone thoroughly familiar with its peculiarities." To demonstrate her point, Miss Marple rose and moved toward the morning room door, deliberately fumbling with its perfectly ordinary handle. Such mechanisms require intimate knowledge, don't they? A visitor might struggle considerably, leaving marks on the paint, perhaps even catching fabric on the latch. Mrs. Blackwood's composure began showing hairline cracks. "We have lived with that door's obstinacy for years. Naturally, I know how to manage it." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "And then there is Helena's urgent legal business. My cousin Raymond has made discreet inquiries with Pemberton, Whitfield, and Associates. Their preliminary findings regarding your management of Helena's trust are quite illuminating. Significant irregularities, I'm told, requiring substantial restitution if exposed." The color drained from Mrs. Blackwood's face. Inspector Craddock produced the silver thimble, its embedded black lace fibers catching the morning light like tiny accusations. "Mrs. Weatherby's thimble tells its own story," he said quietly. "Professional quality, worn smooth by years of expert needlework. The violet powder residue, the precise lace fibers, all confirming her intimate involvement with the mantilla. But Mrs. Weatherby lacks the calculating mind necessary for such elaborate staging. She required guidance, instruction from someone with both technical expertise and compelling motive." Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythm. "The arrangement of evidence troubled me from the beginning. That conveniently upright orchid pot among the general disorder, the ceremonial positioning of the lace, the careful placement of incriminating details, all suggested a mind that planned rather than one that acted in passionate desperation. Mrs. Blackwood's mask of grief finally began disintegrating, replaced by something harder and more calculating. "Helena was going to destroy everything," she said, her voice rising with suppressed fury. "Years of careful management, of difficult decisions to preserve our family's position. She would have bankrupted us all with her naive notions of legal propriety." The admission escaped like steam from a kettle under too much pressure. Inspector Craddock moved closer, recognizing the moment when careful deception finally collapsed under its own weight. "You needed Helena silenced before her investigations bore fruit," Miss Marple observed with quiet certainty. "You orchestrated the demonstration with Mrs. Weatherby, knowing her nervous disposition would make her easily convinced that the death was accidental and that staging the scene would protect both families from scandal." Mrs. Blackwood's composure shattered completely. "She left me no choice. Everything I had built, everything I had preserved, she would have destroyed it all for the sake of principle." The confession hung in the morning air like smoke from a snuffed candle, and Inspector Craddock stepped forward with the grim satisfaction of justice finally served. Mrs. Blackwood's confession settled over the drawing room like dust after an explosion, but Miss Marple recognized that the complete truth required careful excavation from the ruins of such elaborate deception. Inspector Craddock moved with professional efficiency, though his expression betrayed the shock of discovering how thoroughly he had been misdirected by the obvious narrative. "The demonstration with Mrs. Weatherby was quite calculated, wasn't it?" Miss Marple observed gently, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. "What exactly did you tell her about learning such techniques?" Mrs. Blackwood's shoulders sagged as the weight of exposure settled upon her. "I told Hilda that Helena had been receiving threatening letters from a rejected suitor in London, someone who had made disturbing references to strangulation. I suggested we should understand how such attacks might occur, so we could better protect ourselves." Her voice carried the hollow tone of someone whose carefully rehearsed explanations no longer served their purpose. The methodical nature of the deception became clearer with each revelation. Mrs. Blackwood had identified Mrs. Weatherby's nervous disposition and exploited it with surgical precision, using her fear of crime and eagerness to help as weapons more deadly than the lace itself. "And the timing of Helena's legal consultations?" Inspector Craddock pressed, making careful notes. "She was about to expose everything," Mrs. Blackwood admitted, her composed mask finally crumbling completely. "The trust irregularities, the redirected annuities, years of careful financial management that preserved our family's position. Helena would have bankrupted us all with her naive notions of legal propriety." Miss Marple observed how each confession revealed deeper layers of premeditation. The summer fete provided perfect cover, didn't it? So many distractions. And the public quarrel between Helena and Dr. Marsh. Did you orchestrate that as well? A flicker of something almost like pride crossed Mrs. Blackwood's features. "I merely mentioned to Helena that morning that Dr. Marsh had been asking pointed questions about her London plans. She was already agitated about the legal consultations, and her natural temperament required very little encouragement to create the necessary scene. Dr. Marsh, who had been summoned to witness this shocking revelation, stood pale and shaken as the full scope of his manipulation became clear. The burden of false accusation was lifting, only to be replaced by horror at the calculating cruelty that had nearly destroyed him. As Inspector Craddock concluded the formal arrest procedures, Mrs. Blackwood was led away with quiet dignity, her elaborate facade finally abandoned. The drawing room fell silent except for the steady clicking of Miss Marple's needles as she reflected on the intricate web of deception that had nearly achieved its deadly purpose. "It often seems so simple at first glance," Miss Marple mused to Dr. Marsh, her voice soft but clear. "A lover's quarrel, a moment of passion, a tragic accident. It satisfies our need for straightforward explanations. But human nature, like delicate lace, is rarely so simply constructed. She looked at the young doctor with kindly eyes. You were the convenient suspect, Doctor. Your argument with Helena, your obvious distress, it all fit the narrative everyone was eager to embrace. But the truth lay in the small inconsistencies. The ceremonial arrangement of the lace, Mrs. Weatherby's expertise and injuries, the violet powder that connected her to the mantilla, and most tellingly, the instructional voices the vicar overheard. Miss Marple folded her knitting with characteristic precision. Mrs. Blackwood understood that people see what they expect to see, and she used the village's assumptions about passionate crime to conceal far colder motives. She manipulated Mrs. Weatherby's fears and loyalty, orchestrated the evidence, and nearly succeeded in her perfect misdirection. As evening shadows lengthened across Blackwood House, Miss Marple made her quiet way home through familiar village streets. The truth had been revealed. Justice would follow its proper course, and Street Mary Mead would gradually return to its peaceful rhythms. But she reflected, as she often did, on how the strongest threads in human nature's fabric were not always the most visible ones, and how even the most delicate materials could become instruments of destruction when twisted by fear and greed. 3 weeks after Mrs. Blackwood's arrest, Street Mary Mead had settled into that peculiar rhythm of recovery that follows the exposure of carefully guarded secrets. The village green showed no trace of the summer fete's cheerful bunting, and Blackwood House stood shuttered, its conservatory tended now by a caretaker who worked in respectful silence among the orchids that had witnessed such calculated cruelty. Miss Marple received the final details of the trust investigation through a letter from her cousin Raymond. The irregularities had been even more extensive than initially suspected, years of systematic manipulation that had diverted nearly 2/3 of Helena's rightful inheritance into accounts controlled by her mother. The young woman's legal consultations would have exposed a pattern of financial abuse stretching back to her father's death, revealing how maternal grief had gradually transformed into calculated greed, disguised as prudent management. Dr. Marsh had resumed his practice with quiet dignity, though the shadow of false accusation had aged him beyond his years. He stopped by Miss Marple's cottage that morning, carrying late roses as both gratitude and gentle apology for his earlier suspicions about elderly interference in serious matters. "I find myself wondering how she managed it all so precisely," he confided, settling into the familiar chintz armchair. The timing, the evidence, the way she manipulated everyone's assumptions, it required extraordinary calculation. Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands, her expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Blackwood understood something fundamental about human nature, Doctor. People prefer simple explanations for complex tragedies. A lover's quarrel satisfies our need for straightforward motives, while financial conspiracies require uncomfortable questions about respectability and trust." Mrs. Weatherby had returned home under careful supervision, her testimony having proved crucial in establishing the full scope of the conspiracy. The colonel's wife moved through her daily routines with the careful attention of someone seeking redemption through honest labor, though the knowledge of her unwitting participation in murder would haunt her remaining years. Colonel Weatherby himself had been stripped of his military bluster, now moving with weary resignation as he struggled to understand how his protective instincts had failed so completely. The village had absorbed the shock with that remarkable resilience that characterizes small communities facing the unthinkable. Mrs. Price Ridley, after her initial pronouncements, had grown uncharacteristically subdued, perhaps recognizing the depth of her own hasty judgments. The vicar worked tirelessly to counsel his flock through the aftermath, his sermons touching gently on themes of forgiveness and the dangers of assumptions. Most remarkably, the black lace mantilla had been returned to the Spanish convent, where Mrs. Blackwood's grandmother had acquired it decades earlier. The Mother Superior had written graciously, promising that the nuns would pray for all souls touched by its tragic history, transforming an instrument of destruction back into an object of contemplation and peace. As evening shadows lengthened across the familiar streets, Miss Marple reflected on the delicate balance between appearance and reality that governed community life. Mrs. Blackwood had maintained perfect respectability while systematically betraying every trust placed in her as guardian and mother. She had exploited the village's eagerness to accept obvious explanations, using their assumptions as camouflage for calculated murder. The case had revealed how easily beauty could be corrupted, the exquisite lace transformed into a weapon, maternal love twisted into possessive control, community trust manipulated into deadly misdirection. Helena's pursuit of justice had ultimately cost her life, while ensuring that truth would eventually prevail, her stolen inheritance restored to distant relatives who had never known of their loss. Miss Marple sat by her window as darkness gathered, her knitting needles clicking gently in the lamplight. She contemplated, as she often did, the eternal mystery of human nature. How the same capacity for kindness could harbor such startling cruelty, how the most ordinary settings could conceal the most extraordinary deceptions. Street. Mary Mead slept peacefully that night, its secrets finally exposed to healing light. Though Miss Marple knew that somewhere, in some other quiet village, similar dramas of human nature were likely unfolding, requiring patient observation and the wisdom to see patterns that others might miss. 2 months after Mrs. Blackwood's conviction for murder, Street, Mary Mead had begun the delicate process of healing that follows the exposure of carefully hidden evil. The October trial had concluded with a sentence of 20 years, the judge noting the calculated nature of the crime and the systematic financial abuse that had preceded it. Helena's inheritance, fully restored through the court proceedings, and had been donated to establish a scholarship for young women pursuing legal careers, a fitting memorial that transformed her tragic pursuit of justice into lasting good. Miss Marple sat in her garden on this crisp autumn morning, her knitting needles clicking gently as she observed the subtle changes that time and truth had wrought upon her community. Dr. Marsh passed by on his morning rounds, his step lighter than it had been in months. The shadow of false accusation had lifted completely, replaced by a deeper understanding of how precious his freedom and reputation truly were. He had begun courting the young nurse from Much Benham, their quiet courtship observed with approval by a village that had learned to value genuine affection over dramatic passion. Mrs. Weatherby emerged from her cottage with a basket of mending, her nervous disposition gradually settling into purposeful activity. The colonel's wife had discovered an unexpected calling in teaching needlework to the village children, transforming her expertise with delicate fabrics from an instrument of unwitting destruction into a source of creative joy. Her hands, once trembling with guilt and fear, now moved with steady confidence as she guided small fingers through their first careful stitches. Colonel Weatherby himself had undergone perhaps the most profound transformation. The military precision that had once served commanding purposes now protected and nurtured. His understanding of his wife's vulnerabilities deepened by their shared survival of unthinkable circumstances. Their marriage had acquired the quiet intimacy that sometimes follows the weathering of terrible storms. The village had absorbed the shock with characteristic resilience, though not without lasting changes. Mrs. Price Ridley's pronouncements carried less certainty now, tempered by recognition of how thoroughly her hasty judgments had been proven wrong. The vicar's sermons touched more frequently on themes of patience and the dangers of assumption, his own experience of overlooking crucial evidence serving as gentle reminder to his flock. Most symbolically, the black lace mantilla had been returned to the Spanish convent, where Mrs. Blackwood's grandmother had acquired it generations earlier. The Mother Superior had written graciously, promising that the nuns would pray for all souls touched by its tragic history, transforming an instrument of destruction back into an object of contemplation and peace. Blackwood House stood empty now, awaiting new owners who would bring fresh life to rooms that had witnessed such calculated betrayal. The conservatory's orchids bloomed under a caretaker's gentle attention, their exotic beauty unmarked by memory of the terrible scene they had witnessed. As afternoon shadows lengthened across familiar streets, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate pattern that had emerged from that summer's tragedy. The case had demonstrated how perfectly ordinary settings could conceal extraordinary deceptions, how maternal love could transform into possessive destruction, and how community assumptions could become weapons more deadly than any physical instrument. She had learned, once again, that the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood human nature well enough to manipulate it with surgical precision. Mrs. Blackwood had orchestrated not merely murder, but the perfect misdirection that would have ensured an innocent man bore the consequences of her calculated greed. The case had reinforced Miss Marple's long-held belief that truth, like the finest lace, revealed its pattern only to those patient enough to examine its structure thread by thread. The obvious narrative had satisfied most observers because it required no uncomfortable questions about respectability or trust. As evening settled over Street, Mary Mead, Miss Marple folded her knitting with characteristic precision. Justice had been served, the village was healing, and life continued its eternal cycle of joy and sorrow, wisdom and folly. Tomorrow would bring new puzzles, new opportunities to observe human nature's endless complexity, and perhaps new chances to ensure that truth, like her carefully tended roses, bloomed in its proper season.